Welcome to Module 6 in EDD 918, and we'll be looking at motivation and rewards in this module. Hopefully you have the slides there in front of you. And I decided to take a whole module or a whole unit on this topic because it's such an important part of leadership and an important part of organizational behavior and organizational life. How do we effectively motivate others? And I'm just going to use that term, by the way, motivating others. Course I took on this when I was in my doc program, a big long discussion on can you actually motivate others? I'm going to set that aside for now. It's an interesting philosophical discussion, but we're looking at how do we as leaders help to encourage people to do the work, to do the tasks. So if you want to call that motivating them or whatever else, I'll leave that up to you. But we're looking at this topic of motivation and rewards. And the reason why this is so interesting to us, I think, as well as important is, as I put on the slide, this is a basic process, psychological process that's been studied really for years, even predating the studies of organizational behavior and organizational life. And you could put it this way: what makes a person tick, right? What makes a person or causes a person to do what they want to do? And really even some aspects of motivation led to eventually studies more so in the area of leadership. I'll give you a quick example. World War II brought about kind of an increase in studies on leadership. It was already being talked about, but even more so after that, because Adolf Hitler posed a real challenge. Why would people follow this man? And it's easy for us to just put him in the category of an evil, wicked man. I believe he was. But the reality is people followed him. And I know some people want to say, well, he manipulated everybody. No, he didn't. He manipulated some people. He, threatened some people. So there was that. There was the coercion aspect. But the reality is there were a lot of people who willingly followed him and bought into his message. Why? And so that's kind of the thing. So that's the dark side of motivation. But then also, how do we learn about motivating people properly? And that's where you get into in leadership, and I'm sure you studied this leadership theory, charismatic leadership. And there's a bad side to charismatic leadership, but we want leaders to have charisma, to be exciting, to inspire us. So all of that comes into play in this study. And then in the mid-20th century, people actually started then applying motivation to organizations. And a lot of that came about because of those studies, the Hawthorne studies that I talked about earlier in the course. As these individuals, these researchers were in there, how do we help people be more efficient? Then all of a sudden, well, wait a minute, the people were being more efficient because we were paying attention to them. So what does that tell us about motivation and people wanting to be noticed and those kinds of things? And then you'll see that third bullet there on that first slide. That's when psychologists and organizational theorists, they started like crossing the lines of each other. So psychologists are studying the brain functions and what gets a person to do those things. Organizational theorists are saying, so how do we get workers maybe to be more efficient and to produce more? And all of a sudden they realize, hey, we're dealing with some of the same stuff. And many look at that as the beginnings of this field of organizational behavior and the studies in that. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. I guess it's slide 3, the second content slide. So just kind of defining and explaining motivation here. And it's a process, as it says there, a process that starts with a physiological or psychological deficiency or need that activates a behavior or drive that is aimed at a goal or incentive. And so you see there, so it's needs, drives, and incentives. And, I would just point this out as we're looking at this. It is it's a need. And I'm using that term need broadly, right? Because there are certain needs, right? We need to breathe. We need to drink water. We need to eat, right? So there are certain true needs, but a lot of the things that motivate us, if we're going to be real honest, maybe aren't like basic survival needs, and we're going to get into some of that a little bit later on in these lectures. But they're wants, they're desires, and so you can use that term as well. But it feels like a need in the moment, and that activates a behavior or drive to achieve that, right? So my stomach growls, I'm hungry, that activates me, motivates me to go prepare something to eat or find something to eat with the end in mind of I'm going to satisfy that hunger. And so we know how all of that works. So that's basically, the idea of motivation in a nutshell. And then moving on to the next slide, we have intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. And I think as educators, well, I should say not everybody I know is necessarily in this class as a teacher. Many are, but you know this even from your own experience. There's intrinsic and there's extrinsic rewards, right? And I got the famous poster there of the little guy, success. Oof, that feels good. That's that intrinsic motivation, right? I want to achieve a goal. It feels good to achieve something. It feels there's just that personal satisfaction in it. I'll give you an example of that. A few years ago, and I've backed off on this now, I like to run. And a few years ago, I set myself a goal to run a half marathon. And I did. I worked my way up to it. Now, here's the deal, though. My half marathon was my own half marathon. I set up my own course as far as mapped it out, and I ran it on a weekday. And nobody was there to cheer me on. Nobody was there watching me do it. There was no medal at the end, anything like that. I just ran it. Why? Because I had set the goal to run a half marathon, and to me it was just satisfying to do it. Maybe also because I'm a little bit of a cheapskate and I didn't want to drop 50 or 70 or $100 just to get another t-shirt. I don't know, maybe that was part of it. But there was just an intrinsic satisfaction for me. By the way, I'm not close to running half marathons anymore. But there was a satisfaction for me to say that for me personally, I did it. And I don't go around, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong for people to say, but I want the medal, I want the t-shirt, right? But that's what's motivating you, right? There are other things that I want more extrinsic rewards. And then we have the example of the extrinsic reward, the guy jumping on the pile of money. Financial compensation rewards, those are examples of extrinsic rewards, right? They're external to us. And so those are also a motivator. And those can be, obviously in the job place, most of the time we see that in the form of financial kind of motivators, but there's others. If you think about small children in school, those stickers, right? Those smiley face stickers, the stars, boy, those are motivating. I want to do a good job on my paper and get that, or I want to get my picture hung on the wall. So those are extrinsic motivators. So something that's outside of us that drives us to do these kinds of things. And again, this is all basic common sense. We all understand this. But what we want to do is start applying that then to the work environment, to the organizational setting. And so as we look at this, we're looking at some different kinds of motives. And I'm going to move through these pretty quickly because, again, they're we know what they are. And they'll come in the next lecture when we actually start talking about motivation kind of models and how people put these together. But we have the primary motives. These are, as you see, they're unlearned, physiologically based. I already mentioned hunger, thirst, those physical relationships, those kinds of things. Those are all our primary motives. We don't have to learn those, right? I have 2 granddaughters now. They were both born within 6 days of each other last summer, and so they're still in the baby phase. But we didn't have to teach them to be hungry, right? They're born, and some of you may have worked in the labor and delivery areas, right? A baby is born, they're hungry. And so it's unlearned, it's physiologically based. And so those are the kinds of things that are primary motives. And they don't necessarily, but not necessarily taking precedence. And we'll get more into that when we talk about Maslow and Aldifer and some of the others. Because some people say that always takes priority. Yes and no. I'll save that for when we get to that section. And then the next one is we have what are called general motives, and these are things that are more learned, or at least one could say encouraged. So, for instance, curiosity. Do we learn curiosity? I would say no. I would say most of us are born with natural curiosity, but it can definitely be encouraged. And I would say that certain people, personality types, things like that, are maybe more motivated by curiosity than they are by other things. But then you have manipulation, and maybe I could, and we're going to talk about power. That kind of comes in a couple of differences. Do certain people have more of that desire for those things? Sure, they do. And affection, and so those are our general motives. Again, they're natural, but at the same time, they are definitely encouraged and fostered and can be grown. Whereas, if you never a child is born being hungry, feeling hunger, we don't have to foster that or develop that or encourage that. They're going to keep wanting to eat, right? And so that's the idea. Whereas curiosity, we actually can see curiosity, that's probably the best example, stifled, right? When we see that. Kids can be discouraged from being curious, which is kind of sad. But those are the motives that we have there. And then the last one, as far as this general kind of introductory section, are the secondary motives. And these are the ones, as you see there on the side I put, these are the most important that pertain to organizational life. These are the ones that are going to come in, and we'll talk more about these a little bit later on, how these come into play within organizations. But you have power, achievement, affiliation. Those are kind of the big three that have been probably studied and researched the most. And then those other two were added a little bit later, security and status. Those are a little more, if I can put it this way, squishy from a research standpoint. Some research has been done, but the research really holds up on the power, achievement, and affiliation motives. And so again, we're going to see, I'll talk more about those three in particular when we get to that section, but those are the ones that really come into play in organizational life. So again, just kind of that general overview introduction here to motivations, to motives, and what drives us and those kinds of things. And then we'll proceed to talk more about some of these models in our next lecture.